Many great thinkers believe that all of us in the Western world are descendants of one man. That man is Julius Caesar, founder of the Roman Empire. This is why perhaps no other city of the ancient world holds such a fascination for us as Rome, capital of the Roman Empire. Of all the ancient peoples in the world, we feel closest to the Romans because they left us far more than lifeless ruins or pots displayed in glass cases in museums. They left us stories of men and women, their intimate emotions, their thirst for power, and their incredible audacity. Even their faults are evidence of their humanity. Let's embark on an imaginary journey. We'll describe for you the lives of our ancestors, and together we'll journey back through time for a glimpse of what they were really like. We'll see typical streets, houses, and apartment blocks where people lived in Roman times. We'll visit the shops, the baths, the palaces, and the great temples, which were used not only for worship, but as meeting places for trade and commerce. We'll enter the Colosseum to see violent and bloody gladiatorial combat. We'll see all the places where the people who founded Rome gave life to the most powerful and grandiose empire in history. For centuries, Rome enjoyed an uninterrupted expansion, first occupying the Seven Hills and then extending towards the countryside. 3 centuries after the birth of Christ, Rome was indeed the great Rome of the Caesars, the richest, most powerful city of the ancient world. Rome had over 1 million inhabitants, including citizens, soldiers, freedmen, and slaves. Today, it is a modern metropolis where the pace of life is frenetic, and like most capital cities of the world, at times even chaotic. But its inhabitants know that Rome is unique, because the evidence of its long and eventful past, stretching back over 2,700 years, is visible everywhere. Romulus was the legendary founder of Rome and its first king. On the 21st of April, 750 years before the birth of Christ, he traced the perimeter of Roma Quadrata on the Palatine Hill with his plow. Rome soon increased in size to include the Seven Hills, later extending its territory further, until during the reign of the penultimate king, Servius Tullius, the first city wall stretched for 7 miles, built of solid stone. By the end of the Republican age, Rome had already expanded beyond the old city walls, and the Emperor Aurelianus, fearing invasion by the barbarians, ordered the construction of a new wall, about 12 miles long, which we can still admire today These walls, which were frequently restored, defended Rome from her attackers on all sides, up until the last century. To get an idea of the vast size of ancient Rome, we must pay a visit to the Museum of Roman Civilization in EUR, the modern part of the city which was begun in the 30s. It contains this enormous model, which reproduces Rome as it was in the 4th century AD, during the period of its maximum expansion. From a small village on the Palatine Hill, Rome became the greatest metropolis of the ancient world. The first inhabitants were shepherds, who buried their dead in the damp, marshy valley where the Forum now stands. 10 centuries later, the perimeter of Rome measured almost 12.5 miles in length. In the 4th century AD, Rome comprised over 400 districts and boasted 28 libraries, 10 theaters, and hundreds of squares. 8 bridges crossed the Tiber. 29 main roads linked the center with its periphery. Every day, 19 aqueducts transported 1.5 billion liters of water to supply 1,500 public fountains, the thousands of baths, as well as the 11 great bath complexes. And then there were the forums, great open spaces where the very heart of the city beat, and the most spectacular of these was the Roman Forum. Enormous crowds gathered here at all hours of the day. The Forum was full of people of every nationality. The Roman Senate met nearby in the Curia building. Street vendors, patrician ladies on their litters, and senators mingled with lawyers waiting for their clients and ordinary passers-by. A bustling mass of people going in and out of the temples and palaces, chatting with friends in the square, shouting and asking for favors, buying and selling everything under the sun. Today, this is what we can see from the top of the Campidoglio. But 3,000 years ago, it must have looked something like this. This was a marshy, unhealthy plain, fed by a river, probably the Velabro. This was the reason for the first developments on the Palatine Hill, where Roma Quadrata was built 7 centuries before Christ. The marsh was later drained, and the expansion of Rome began. During the last period of the Republic, in the 1st century BC, Rome was a powerful, dominating force in the Mediterranean, and the Forum reflected her grandeur, assuming monumental form. When the consul Cicero hurled accusations against the revolutionary Catiline and the general Mark Antony read the will of Julius Caesar to the Roman people, the Roman Forum appeared thus. The great building of the Temple of Saturn, the Basilica Sempronia, built in 169 BC, and next to it, the Temple of the Dioscuri. Opposite, the Basilica Aemilia, built by the consul Fulvius Nobilior, and finally the paved floor. Under the Emperor Augustus, the Roman Forum became the stage of imperial greatness, where peoples of all the known world converged. Temples were built and public buildings, as well as the luxurious homes of the emperors on the Palatine Hill. All helped to make it a unique setting. And even when other forums were created close by, such as that of the divine Augustus or of Trajan, the Roman Forum retained its importance for the Rome of the Caesars. Without doubt, the most spectacular view of the Forum must have been during the imperial period, at the moment of maximum expansion of the Roman Empire, when the peoples of 4 continents converged on the Roman Forum. The paved area in front of the Temple of Saturn was occupied by numerous columns and monuments to commemorate the deeds of the emperors and their faithful servants. On the right is the Basilica Julia, erected by Julius Caesar. To one side stands the temple of Castor and Pollux, the protective deities of the nobility. On the left, the Basilica Aemilia from the Republican period, which has survived. It has been restored more than once after numerous fires. Above, on the right, is the imperial residence on the Palatine Hill, and in the distance, the Colosseum. But now let's take a closer look at some of the more important monuments of the Roman Forum. This view shows the side of the Forum which lies at the foot of the Campidoglio. It was once full of buildings, such as the Tabularium, the Temple of the Concordia, that of Vespasian and Titus, and that of Saturn, where the state's treasure was kept, which in Caesar's time consisted of 13 tons of gold, 114 tons of silver, and 30 million sesterces. Around the 4th century AD, the area looked like this, with a paved floor and triumphal arches and monuments. Above, from left to right, the temples of Saturn and those of Vespasian and Titus. And finally, on the hill of the Campidoglio, stood the Tabularium, the state archives, where the city hall stands today. A very important area of the Forum lay at the foot of the Palatine Hill, between the Temple of Castor and Pollux and the Temple of Vesta, which was in the shape of a hut and guarded the sacred fire and the Palladium depicting Minerva, the goddess of justice. This is all that remains of the Temple of Castor and Pollux, built to commemorate a battle won by the Romans. About the 4th century after Christ, this area would have appeared like this, with the Arch of Augustus, a structure composed of 3 barrel vaults, erected in front of the Temple of Vesta. To the right, the Temple of Castor and Pollux. Rising above it all, the imperial palace, which probably belonged to the Emperor Caligula, famous for his fits of madness, which culminated in his nominating his favorite horse as senator. This was the house of the Vestal Virgins, a sort of convent that housed the small but much respected community of priestesses. It was the only example of female priesthood in Rome. Their duty was to take care of the Temple of Vesta. The Vestals were of aristocratic birth, removed from their families when they were between 6 and 10 years of age, and they had to remain virgins. If a Vestal dared to break her oath, she was buried alive, because the blood of a Vestal could not be spilt. Along the Via Sacra, the sacred way, while still in the Roman Forum, we can see one of the most impressive buildings of imperial Rome, the Basilica of Maxentius. It was a masterpiece of engineering, so perfect that it inspired Michelangelo when he designed the interior of St. Peter's over 1,000 years later. Ordered by Maxentius, the building was completed by the Emperor Constantine in 315 AD. Like all Roman basilicas, it was a kind of law court where justice was administered in a continuous coming and going of lawyers, their defendants, and witnesses. All under the watchful eye of the statue of Constantine, the fragmented remains of which are preserved in the forecourt of the Palazzo on the Campidoglio, a giant hand, a foot, and the head. In front of the Basilica of Maxentius stretched the panorama of the Palatine Hill. This area, already occupied by the houses of the nobility, was used for the residences of the emperors, becoming a complex without equal in the ancient world. And some 2,000 years ago, this is the view that a visitor would have had, looking up at the palaces of the emperors. To give some idea of the magnificence of these imperial palaces, here is the triclinium of the Domus Flavia, the banqueting room built by the architect Rabirius for the Emperor Domitian. In spaces like these, the Roman emperors took their evening meals, which lasted for hours, ending long after midnight. They dined lying down on couches called triclinia, as all rich Romans did, while hundreds of slaves served the wine, carved the meat, and collected the plates, which, according to custom, were tossed under the tables when empty. Lotteries were often played, with lavish prizes to be won, and it was not uncommon for a couple of slaves to be forced to fight to the death as a supper-time entertainment. It was in this room, during a sumptuous reception, that the Praetorian Guards killed Elvius Pertinax after proclaiming him emperor only 80 days before. The Roman Forum was not the only important center of activity in the city. There was the incredible Circus Maximus, where chariot races were held, an arena 678 yards long and 130 yards wide, which could seat more than 150,000 people. It lay in the Mercia Valley, between the Aventine and the Palatine Hills, where the imperial residences were situated, another spectacular view of which can be seen from here. This is how it must have looked to those crowds of spectators packed into the arena below, who regarded the Palatine as the eighth wonder of the world. But life in ancient Rome was not played out entirely within the intimacy of the home, whether rich or poor. Whatever the season, they chose to live outdoors, filling the streets and squares with bustling crowds. There were many places where people could meet and spend their free time together. They had plenty because the state granted over 200 holidays every year, including both religious and public festivals. The baths were certainly one of the most popular places. To get an idea of the enormous dimensions of a bath complex, let's visit Santa Maria degli Angeli. In the 16th century, the great Hall of the Baths was converted into this church by Michelangelo. It occupies only a part of the bath complex, built under the Emperor Diocletian. But in ancient Rome, there were other impressive bath complexes. The Baths of Caracalla, which could hold nearly 2,000 people. They were used continuously for over 300 years, until 537 AD, when the barbarian king Vitige cut off the aqueducts, and they ceased to function. The baths covered an area of about 11 hectares and had cisterns which could hold 80,000 cubic meters of water. These baths were built by the Emperor Caracalla in the year 212 AD. The entrance fee cost a quadrante, a very small sum of money, for which men and women could bathe together, among statues, mosaics, and frescoes, in the pools of hot and cold water. They could read, discuss, and listen to the most fashionable writers of the time who came to the baths to recite their latest works. The bathers also engaged in gymnastics and played ball games. This continued until 138 AD, when the Emperor Hadrian banned mixed bathing after a series of scandals in the baths. The most crowded area was the Natatio, a large open-air pool. And this is how it would have looked to the bathers, filled with fresh, clean water from the aqueduct of the Aqua Marcia. The Romans loved to go to the theatre, although they preferred light entertainment, like pantomimes, aquatic spectacles, and even striptease shows, rather than tragedies. In fact, it was quite common for the public to demand that actresses take off their clothes. The poet Horace tells us of a certain Arbuscula who refused, saying, "I prefer to give pleasure to a few people with my art than to many with my body." The crowd was furious and threw her off the stage, recounts Horace. This could have happened in this very building, the Theatre of Marcellus. Its construction was begun by Julius Caesar 17 years before the birth of Christ, and dedicated to Marcellus, the adopted son of the Emperor Augustus. It was more than 98 feet high and could hold about 20,000 spectators. This is how the Theatre of Marcellus would have appeared together with the Temple of Apollo, situated only 6 meters away from the external wall of the theatre and the Temple of Bellona. Surrounding this complex were hundreds of insulae, rented apartment blocks, where the great majority of the Romans lived. Our shopping centers of today give the impression that nothing could be more typical of late 20th century life, but this idea of shopping was first invented by the ancient Romans. What you are seeing is the first great shopping complex in the history of the human race, Trajan's Market. Constructed by the great architect Apollodorus of Damascus by order of the Emperor Trajan. It was a revolutionary concept, not only because of its architectural design, but also for its functional character. It had 3 floors, with numerous shops selling everything imaginable, from cloth to jewelry, all kinds of foods and household goods. The most crowded area was the Great Hall of the market, which served to accommodate the large numbers of people buying and selling. There were also many taverns, like those along this street called the Via Biberatica, where Romans ate and drank. Here is a tavern in Ostia, Rome's seaport, a typical popina, or inn of the time. They were very popular places to eat, as most houses of the plebs, or common people, had no kitchens. But what did the ancient Romans eat and drink? There were barley and lentil soups, roast meats, always accompanied with bread. The Romans were great consumers of bread, which all of them could afford. There was even one loaf called dog's bread, pan furfurius, which was also eaten by the very poor. And then there was the garum, a sauce made by leaving the interiors of various types of fish to rot in the sun. Then by filtering this mush, one obtained a liquid with an extremely powerful smell. The garum was used as an accompaniment to all types of food. And there was always wine, although it was usually watered down with salty seawater or mixed with honey, resins, and spices of every kind. As we are told in an ancient recipe book, written by the gourmet Marcus Gavinus Apicius. In their taverns, the Romans also loved to gamble. One very popular game was similar to the chess we play today. It was so common that what looks like a chess board was found cut into the marble of the stairway of the Basilica Julia in the Roman Forum. This Roman coin depicts the Flavian Amphitheatre. Yes, it is commonly known as the Colosseum, and was the most popular place in all of Rome. Here the gladiators fought each other to the death and drove the ancient Roman spectators wild as they cheered them on, like the crowds in a football stadium today. We're not sure who the ingenious architect was, perhaps Rabirius, Domitian's architect, or a certain Gaudenzio. The Colosseum is perhaps the most famous monument in the world. What is certain is that, reaching an incredible height of 157 feet, it has amazed and fascinated all who have seen it down through the ages. A venerable Bede in the Middle Ages said, "When the Colosseum falls, so will Rome." It was built in a valley between the Palatine, Esquiline, and Cælian hills, and its construction required hundreds of thousands of huge travertine marble blocks. It was ordered by the Emperor Vespasian to celebrate the greatness of the empire, and was inaugurated by the Emperor Titus in 80 AD. A series of spectacular shows was organized for the occasion, which lasted 100 days, during which over 5,000 wild beasts were slaughtered. The Colosseum was built on 4 levels and was covered by a huge awning, the velarium, which protected the audience from the sun. The first level was 34.5 feet high, decorated by half columns in the Doric style. The second level, with columns in the Ionic style, was almost 39 feet high. The third had Corinthian columns and was 38 feet high. The fourth floor consisted of a continuous wall with a system of wooden poles which supported the velarium. Complicated drainage work had been carried out before its construction began, as there had been a small lake here used by Nero for the monumental imperial residence he called his Golden Palace, the Domus Aurea. Nero had created a rambling series of buildings and gardens. To achieve his wild plans, he ordered hundreds of houses to be cleared and their occupants thrown into the street, while he and his court continued their revels unconcerned. Then a terrible fire destroyed much of Rome, raging on for 9 days. The story that Nero started the fire and watched Rome burn from his balcony while singing songs and accompanying himself on the lyre is, unfortunately, untrue. He was in the country when the fire broke out and hurried back, helping to direct efforts to fight the blaze. He opened temples and public parks to provide shelter for the victims. Despite his efforts, however, rumors persisted that he was responsible for the disaster. So Nero shifted the blame onto Rome's small community of Christians. But the emperor's personal excesses, as well as his expensive building schemes, including the Domus Aurea, which covered a quarter of Rome, sealed his fate. The Praetorian Guard finally rose up in revolt and brought the curtain down on his insanities. Nero was obliged to commit suicide, and his unfinished Domus Aurea was abandoned. His successor, the Emperor Vespasian, ordered the lake to be drained and the Colosseum to be built, erasing all traces of Nero's reign. A system of steps and galleries gave access to the various sectors of the gradinate, or bleachers. The galleries, situated on the first floor of the Colosseum, would have looked like this. You could meet all kinds of people here, vendors of fritters made from chickpea flour, hot drinks and souvenirs, or people who hired out cushions and blankets for a small sum because the shows continued late into the night. In the intervals between one show and another, people could look out from the upper levels of the Colosseum and admire the spectacular views over the city. This is the Via dei Fori Imperiali, the road which links Piazza Venezia with the Colosseum, as it is today. It is a very busy road, crossed every day by thousands of people and crowds of tourists. It represents one of the most contested acts of fascism, because in order to build this wide boulevard, hundreds of historical buildings from medieval times, as well as the Renaissance and 18th century Rome, were demolished. A small hill, which had existed since the birth of Rome, was also leveled to make way for the road planned for new triumphal marches. This is how it would have looked in the 3rd century AD. On our left is a reconstruction of the imposing colonnade at the entrance of the Temple of Venus, and this statue, which was over 38 feet high, representing a solar divinity. On our right is the densely populated zone, which was known as the 4th region. This is what remains of what was the grandiose Temple of Venus and Rome, designed by Emperor Hadrian himself in 135 AD, in an area already occupied by the atrium of Nero's Golden House. The construction of this temple was sharply criticized by Apollodorus of Damascus, the architect who had designed Trajan's market. For his audacity in publicly condemning the work of a Roman emperor, he paid with his life. On the left, we can see the Via Sacra, the Sacred Way, which looked like this, and the Arch of Constantine, the largest of the triumphal arches to survive. And in front of it, the Meta Sudante, a monumental fountain situated where the 5 regions of the city met. Above us on the left is believed to be the site of the temple of Eliogabalo. A general view of the area must have looked like this, with the road along which the Roman emperors marched in triumph. This area in front of the Colosseum was used for many magnificent parades, like the one for Constantine's victory over Maxentius at the Ponte Milvio in 312 AD. This arch was built in his honor, and we can admire it today in front of the Colosseum. In the 4th century AD, it looked like this, although it would have been painted in colors. This statue of a barbarian must originally have been painted too. The people who crowded into the Colosseum were drawn there by their lust for blood, which flowed in the arena. We don't know if tickets were sold or if entrance was free. What is certain is that the crowds never tired of the violence and cruelty on show for their pleasure, resulting in the atrocious deaths of thousands of gladiators, slaves who were forced to fight, and animals. Gladiators fought to the death in front of 70,000 people screaming for blood. The Reziari, with their nets and tridents, were pitted against the Mirmilloni, so called because their helmets bore the sign of a fish called the Mirmillo. The Samnites used sword and shield to fight the Thracians, who were skilled in the use of the Sica, a long, sharp dagger. The gladiators were taught how to die in the most heroic and dramatic fashion to milk more applause from the public. And the public's approval was very important, because at the end of the fight, the life of the loser was literally in their hands. Thumbs up meant life to the loser, and thumbs down meant death. There was no military victory, religious festival, or anniversary which was not celebrated with bloody combat. In just one of these celebrations, organized by the Emperor Trajan and lasting for 117 consecutive days, more than 9,000 gladiators died in the arena. Beneath this arena lay a labyrinth of subterranean passages where the gladiators and the ferocious beasts awaited their turn to die. It must have resembled a scene from Dante's Inferno, with the perpetual din of crying and screaming and the roaring of the wild beasts. A place where the stars of the show, animals and gladiators, used to prepare for their entrances, the effects of which were often heightened by the use of hoists and ramps. With bated breath, the public sat in a frenzy of anticipation for the climactic death scene. Up in the arena, incredible theatrical settings were created in record time by specialists to make the continuous fights more exciting. They lasted from dawn to sunset, and often by the flicker of flaming torches continued until late into the night. The most violent were devised by the Emperor Claudius, horrific fights involving hundreds of gladiators, where the massacre had to be completed in the shortest possible time. Scenes such as these became the tragic setting for other brutal massacres, when innocent Christians were thrown into the arena to be torn to pieces by ferocious beasts. This form of slaughter was ended only 3 centuries later by order of the Emperor Constantine, who proclaimed Christianity the official religion of the empire and banned gladiatorial combat as a form of entertainment. All roads lead to Rome, goes the proverb, as this medieval copy of an ancient Roman road map demonstrates. Rome lay at the center of a dense network of consular roads which linked it with every corner of the empire. The most important were the Via Aurelia, the Via Flaminia, the Via Cassia, the Via Salaria, the Via Tiburtina, the Via Casilina, and the Via Appia, queen of the consular roads. Built in the year 312 BC, it linked Rome with the south. After passing through the city of Capua, it ended at the port of Brindisi. It was 364 Roman miles long, about 650 kilometers. Once outside the city walls, the Appia soon becomes a decorative passageway between monuments honoring the dead, such as this one dedicated to Caecilia Metella, daughter-in-law of Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of Rome's richest citizens. But if these consular roads were wide and spacious, the same cannot be said of the urban streets of imperial Rome, which were much narrower and often tortuous. The major part of the city was suffocated by buildings piled one on top of the other in a chaotic jumble. The modern monument to King Victor Emmanuel II, known to tourists as the Wedding Cake, stands today in Piazza Venezia, in an area which in ancient times was cluttered with all kinds of buildings, mostly private homes. Romans looked down from their balconies, like this one we have reconstructed, onto an intricate web of alleyways and piles of buildings. In fact, during the 3rd century AD, it would probably have looked something like this, full of insulae, or apartment blocks, some of which were as high as 8 or 9 stories, like the Insula Felicles, just near here. In the distance, where centuries later the Victor Emmanuel monument was to be built, lay the temple of Juno Moneta, and next to it, the Roman Mint. Life in the insulae was often inhuman. There was no running water. They were infested with rats. The rooms, especially those on the upper floors, were overcrowded, and the weight frequently caused these buildings to collapse. Walking round these insulae at night was a risky business. The inhabitants took advantage of the dark to get rid of their garbage, and scraps of refuse and filth of every sort rained down on anyone unfortunate enough to pass underneath at that moment. The aspiration of all Romans was to escape from these human anthills and live in a domus, a proper house, with a single floor, if possible with a garden and an orchard. And if this were impossible in Rome itself, where the cost of property was high, one could always make do with a house in one of the numerous provincial towns, where life was still on a human level. One of the most beautiful houses in the ancient city of Pompeii, just over 120 miles from Rome, the House of the Faun, covered over 3,000 square yards, an entire city block, and it consisted of numerous rooms. Its floors were decorated with splendid mosaics. This one represents the battle between Alexander the Great and Darius. And there were statues like this bronze which adorned the pool in the entrance, a Greek statuette from the 2nd century BC. This is a modern copy. The original is kept in the National Museum in Naples. Let's see how the atrium of this domus would have looked when it was inhabited. It was typical of those found in Rome and the rest of Italy. Since we are in Pompeii, let's consider this ancient city, which has been restored to us at last. "2,000 years ago, Pompeii lay at the center of a fertile valley with abundant water, in a wide gulf of the sea known as Mare Nostrum, rich in fishing and easily navigated. It was a city based on trade, cloth and other manufactured goods, but above all, its precious wines and its garum, the sauce which drove the Roman gourmets wild. In 62 AD, Pompeii, with all the other towns in the vicinity of the volcano Vesuvius, suffered a terrible earthquake which caused widespread damage. With the financial assistance of the Emperor Nero, the inhabitants of Pompeii immediately set about the work of reconstruction. They restored the houses, the monuments, and the baths destroyed by the earthquake. They were oblivious to the hidden threat of the volcano. In a painting of that period, Vesuvius is depicted as a tranquil mountain covered with trees and vineyards. 79 years after the birth of Christ, on the 24th of August, that idyllic peace was suddenly shattered. Vesuvius erupted with terrible fury. The eruption was apocalyptic. The volcano exploded into the air, throwing molten rock up to a great height, which then fell back to earth in a blizzard of ash and scalding rain. Poisonous gases formed a blanket that hid the sun. In Pompeii alone, out of a population of 10,000, over 2,000 died, suffocated by the sulfurous gases as they tried to escape, crushed under falling masonry, or burned by the white-hot particles of lava, which rapidly buried the city under a blanket of volcanic slag, over 20 feet deep. Pompeii and other cities, such as Stabia, Oplontis, and Herculaneum, were wiped off the face of the earth. Never in living memory had the ancient world suffered a similar disaster in such a densely populated area. Pompeii came to light in the mid-18th century, just a few years after Herculaneum. A foreigner, the Prince d'Elbeuf, an enthusiastic hunter and passionate scholar of classic antiquities, made this sensational discovery. 3 splendid statues were recovered from a deep well, which so delighted Queen Maria Amalia that her consort, Charles III of Bourbon, King of Naples, decided to undertake large-scale excavations of the area. Once down the well, the experts employed by the sovereign were faced with an exciting discovery. They had descended into the middle of a great Roman theater, decorated with marble and statues. But an even greater surprise was in store. A few days after the beginning of the excavations, a stone slab was discovered, on which was written Herculanenses. Buried for over 1,600 years, 65 feet under the volcanic mud, was the theater of the lost city of Herculaneum. This discovery so excited Charles III that he began further excavations in the area where Pompeii was thought to be buried. And so, in 1756, this ancient city also began to surface once again. This gateway is the Porta Marina, one of the entrances to the city. In ancient times it was called the Porta Neptunia, or Portuensis, because only a short distance from Pompeii, at the mouth of the river Sangro, there was a port which connected it with the farthest parts of the empire. The first large building along the Via Marina was the Basilica, where two magistrates held audiences and businessmen discussed and drew up contracts. This is the Temple of Apollo, which dates back to at least 600 years before the birth of Christ. Apollo was a Greek god, and this temple demonstrates the influence that the Greeks had on Pompeii, an influence so strong that the sun god, Apollo, became the patron of the city. In the temple, a sundial marked the hours for the faithful of Pompeii. Situated at the end of the sacred enclosure, it combined both Greek and Roman elements. A Corinthian-style colonnade surrounded the sanctuary. We have evidence that the colonnade consisted of 2 stories, though excavations of the area have not revealed any traces of the upper level. In Pompeii, as in every Roman city, there was a forum, the main square, the center of the religious, political, and commercial life of the city. It was a true pedestrian area in complete tranquility, where the Pompeians used to participate in public events and attend to their personal affairs. The 2-storied portico had not only a decorative purpose, but also prevented the passage of vehicles. In this square were the city's administrative offices and the city archives. Nearby was the Comitium, where the Pompeians went to vote. On the right side of the forum was the building built by the rich noblewoman Eumachia, high priestess of Venus. It was the seat of the Corporation of the Bleachers of Linen and probably served as a sales room. At the main entrance were the public latrines for visitors. The urine was collected here and then used in the manufacture of wool to make it softer. The Temple of Jupiter stood in a prominent position, its facade of 6 columns over 33 feet high. Of all the statues in the temple, only this head of Jupiter has survived. This is a copy. The original is housed in the National Museum of Naples. But let's see how this area would have appeared in antiquity. Behind the area of the Forum, a bath complex was built soon after 80 BC. Men and women had different entrances and bathed in separate areas of the complex. Inside the area known as the Tepidarium, there are still 3 bronze benches and a great brazier to heat the room, the generous gift of a bronze industrialist from Capua, Marcus Nigidius Vacula. To one side of the baths, at the crossroads between the Via del Foro and the Via di Nola, lay the temple of Fortuna Augusta, dedicated to the personification of the lucky star of the emperors. As you can see, the design of the temple of Fortuna Augusta imitates that of the more grandiose construction of the Jupiter Capitolium, which we saw earlier in the Forum. In front stands the portico with some private houses and the triumphal arch of Caligula. The Odeon, or Little Theatre, was built by Marcus Porcius and Quintius Valgus, the 2 supreme magistrates of the city. It was covered in such a way as to guarantee perfect acoustics for the spectators arranged on the gradinate, the bleachers. At the sides of the cavea, 2 kneeling telemons are depicted. The great theatre was built on the slope of the hill, following the model of Greek theatres. It was covered by wide awnings to protect the spectators from the sun. But let's see how the stage of this theatre would most likely have looked. The fascination in our discovery of Pompeii lies not so much in the great buildings which adorned the city, but in the roads, the houses, and the shops, which are the greatest attraction. Some streets still bear the scars of cartwheel tracks worn away by the constant flowing traffic of the time. Here are houses where not only the foundations, but entire floors, ceilings, and balconies are preserved. One of the most famous houses is without doubt that of the Vetii, two brothers, descendants of a family of freed slaves who prospered and became rich through commerce. The Vetii completely restructured the house, placing numerous statues in the garden and completely renovating the decoration with numerous frescoes. These frescoes are the Amorini, the Cupids, which are among the most famous of the Pompeian frescoes and reflect the great industry which characterized Pompeii. Outside the walls of the city lay the Villa of the Mysteries. After the earthquake of 62 AD, this villa was transformed into a farm, specializing in the production of the famous wines of the area, such as the Vesuvinum. This is a copy of an ancient wooden wine press. After the grapes were crushed, they were passed through a series of channels to reach the cistern where the juice was fermented. The Villa of the Mysteries is most famous for its triclinium, or dining room, where the owners of the house and their guests enjoyed banquets and musical entertainment. The walls are covered in a series of frescoes, some of the most beautiful in antiquity, which depict a Dionysian rite. The inhabitants of Pompeii must have spent much of their time out of doors in the streets, which bustled with the continual coming and going of people, carriages and carts, transporting goods to such an extent that some streets were made one way only. The continuous traffic must have made them very noisy. Here we are at the crossroads between the Via dell'Abbondanza and the Via Stabiana, a part of the town full of shops. The column, linked to the great reservoir, served to distribute water to the shops and neighboring houses. It was situated near a fountain, one of many, placed at the crossroads of the city. The many fountains of Pompeii were built by its administrators. One reason being that at election time a new fountain could guarantee many votes. The political campaigns were very lively in Pompeii and were a continuous event because public office lasted only 1 year. Prostitutes even found themselves involved in political propaganda, publicly taking sides. We read here that Azalina and her girls urge you to elect Gaius Lollius Fuscus as Minister of Public Affairs. And this is only one of over 11,000 graffiti which cover the walls of Pompeii. This caricature at the Villa of the Mysteries pokes fun at a certain Rufus. The ground floors of the houses in Pompeii were occupied by shops and workshops of every kind, such as this tavern opposite the baths of the Forum, where hot drinks were ladled from vessels walled into the serving counters. This is the laundry of Stefanos in Via dell'Abbondanza, where woolen cloth was worked and dyed in great vats. And here is the shop of Modestus. Before the eruption of Vesuvius, it looked like this, with the millstones and the oven for baking bread for the inhabitants of the city. Pompeii, rediscovered in the 18th century, and Rome, whose ruins have fascinated travelers throughout the ages, are two exceptional examples of what was once the Roman Empire. Rome did not invent education, but it developed it to a new, previously unknown level, building schools in every corner of the empire, and with the schools, theaters and aqueducts. It did not invent sculpture as a means of portraying the human figure, but it gave it that realistic effect which was lacking in the idealized art of the Greeks. Roman law is still the basis of modern jurisprudence. Its language became the basis for the language of Italy, Spain, France, Romania, and Latin America, as well as a base from which English has developed. It did not invent the arch, the vault, or the dome, but it used these elements with such an audacity that in some fields its architecture has remained unsurpassed and an example for our modern architecture. The form of our cities of today reproduces the image of the urban structure of the streets, squares, and markets of Roman cities. The Roman heritage still plays a part in our lives thousands of times every day. We cannot but agree with the poet Marziale, who declared in the 1st century AD, Rome, no city in the world is your equal, and none comes even close to you.